Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session, and thank you, Hitomi, for being here with us. I'm just going to give a little bit of intro to Hitomi and get us started. It's been a beautiful day, a lot of learnings, a lot of heavy stories, and a lot of growth in many of us, I can tell already. But we've been really excited because Hitomi's been a volunteer with the John Humphrey Centre we were just counting the years, at least 4 or 5 years, and Hitomi's always been just this kind of solid force behind us and somebody we can really count on. But I'll just read your bio, Hitomi, because it's actually so beautiful, if that's okay. So Hitomi was born in Japan, adopted by American military, and saw many parts of the world before she graduated from high school. Her adopted mother spent her life denying her Cherokee Indian background, and Hitomi was subjected to a significant amount of racism in school. And as a result, she had to become a human rights advocate at a pretty young age. And when she immigrated to Canada in the 1990s, she went back to university in political science, the best faculty, and sociology to learn more about Canada's multicultural society and become involved with Japanese Canadian communities across the country. She was president of the Ottawa Japanese Community Association, chosen by the Japanese embassy to be a Japanese Canadian Leadership Delegate to Japan, is actively involved with the Edmonton Japanese Community Association, one of our partners on this convention, as well as volunteer at the John Humphrey Centre. And I just have to say to everybody, Hitomi, all the work that's, you've been seeing in the program from the National Association of Japanese Canadians and the Edmonton Japanese Community Association has been Hitomi in the background, putting that all together, supporting all the speakers and making that a reality. And Hitomi, you've been such a beautiful blessing and part of this gathering. So thank you so much for being with us, and thanks for adjusting and being willing to share your knowledge with us this afternoon before we get onto the panel. So I'll pass it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Renee. I appreciate that. And I just want to thank the John Humphrey Centre for all of the abilities to be able to speak and talk about the Japanese issues and to share what we as a national association do across the country. And as well, I just want to thank the technical people behind us, because without them, we would not be coming to you so well. And so today, I'm going to try in a very short period of time to talk a little bit about citizenship and what it means within the framework of the Japanese, because I think it's a great example of how we restrict our abilities for individuals during a time of war. And so if someone wants to share the PowerPoint and start out, I'm just going to go through the second slide, please. And this is just a very brief description of what I'm going to be going through, and we'll try to get through this information as quickly as possible because I know there is a panel at 5 o'clock, and so, we're kind of sad in some ways that we weren't able to present this at the beginning of the day, because a lot of the panels have been about citizenship, immigration, and refugees, and those kinds of things. But that's all right. What we'll discuss is a bit of a definition and ways of citizenship, some of the rights and responsibilities. And then I'm going to be focusing a lot on the elimination of citizenship as an individual and what that means with respect to periods during war and the legislation around it. So if we can advance the next slide, you'll see a definition here of citizenship. These are dictionary definitions of citizenship. And basically, it's someone who is living in a country that's at war with the country of origin for the particular individual. And I've given you 3 different definitions here, but they all pretty much mean the same thing. The next slide gives you a definition of enemy alien. And it's always surprising in so many ways that you think about there's actually a definition for enemy alien, and there is. And there's a legal international definition that has been used in all countries, and it's basically interesting because immediately with the use of the War Measures Act, there were approximately 8,600 individuals that were identified as enemy aliens. And I'm going to come back to that, as well as the second bullet about media and how these things kind of impact our definition of enemy alien. So if we can go to the next slide, thank you very much. I'm just going to talk a little bit about ways to become a citizen. So you can become a citizen by birth. You can become a citizen, interestingly enough, if you are abandoned before the age of 7, which is kind of that was one of those things that seemed a little bit jarring, to think that if you're abandoned and you are living in Canada, you can become a citizen. If you are born overseas to either parent that's a Canadian citizen, you become a citizen through taking the oath of citizenship, and in special cases such as refugee claim situations. So if we can advance that, I just wanted to give that as an example. But I also wanted to provide the example of the Princess Margriet from the Netherlands. There's tulips in Ottawa as a result of the Dutch being very grateful for the fact that we gave the family, the Dutch prince and princess, asylum during the war. And their third daughter, as you can see from this, was born here in Canada. There is some rumors that they brought Dutch soil, which is not the case. They just declared the hospital, the Ottawa General, as extraterritorial, basically that it wasn't part of Canada, so that she could be defined as a Dutch citizen. And in Dutch law, unopposed to Canadian law, they go by what is called jus sanguis, which is basically justice by blood, which is birth, opposed to birth, which is jus soli. And so there are some legal terminology around that, but because of her bloodline, she was able to continue as the princess. So if you can go to the next slide. One of the issues around citizenship is loyalty. And I guess that's one of the first things that you always want to look at, is the standpoint of loyalty of citizenship. And the intent of citizenship, not only from a loyalty standpoint, carries certain rights and responsibilities, and there's certain aspirations as a group that we share common principles and values, and that we all stand with the country and we will be loyal to the country. This loyalty was questioned during the period of war, and we'll see that in some of the additional slides. If you can move it forward, please. Thank you very much. Some of the benefits, I'm sure most of us know what the benefits are. I think Canadians who are born in Canada don't often think about how much of a benefit it is to be a Canadian citizen, but the right to vote and the right to be able to get benefits from the state and the right to have a passport are things that I think many people who are born in a country take for granted. But for individuals who come from a country that has been war-torn, or who are refugees or immigrants, and I'm an immigrant as well, we take these very much to heart, because they're hard to get sometimes in other countries. Please advance. Just quickly, some rights of citizenship. There are fundamental rights as part of the Charter of Rights and Freedom, which are outlined here. I'm not going to go into huge detail, because you can read these for yourself at a later point in time, because we'll make the slide deck available to all of you. But most of these, I think most of us already understand and know. If you can advance this to the next slide for responsibilities of citizenship. So part of citizenship is that there are rules that define what we can do as citizens. And if we don't follow these rules, then we can have our citizenship taken away. And so some of these responsibilities is to obey the laws, of course, but voting in elections is something that a lot of individuals don't understand what a right that is. Other countries, you may get shot for voting, and that's tough, because I've been in other countries where people have had to be protected by armed guards in order to be able to vote in an election. And we don't have those issues here. And I just want to emphasize that some of the rights and responsibilities as being a Canadian, those who are not Canadian and become Canadian citizens take that to heart a lot more than I think Canadians. And so you might want to think about, if you didn't have these rights, what kinds of difference it would make. So now if you move it to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about having your rights taken away from you. So the first three are some of the older rules, which have changed over a period of time. If you're a dual citizen, this has changed. There have been periods where you can't be a dual citizen of the US and Canada. There's other periods where you could. There are specific countries where you can't be a dual citizen because you won't be recognized. I know that, and please don't hold this against me, but I have American citizenship, and being Japanese by birth, I had to become an American citizen and had to relinquish my Japanese citizenship because American bases won't, I was adopted, of course, American bases won't recognize individuals who are not American. And so this comes down to the dual citizenship that some countries will allow it and some won't. Canada is at a state now where they will allow dual citizenship with other countries. There is a period of time in Canada where if you were married to someone if you were a Canadian and married to someone from outside the country, that you would lose your citizenship. The bottom five are ones now that are more common within the law, and I will just say that these change with legal status. Our laws constantly change with respect to citizenship, and so I think most laws across the world include at least the first three, which is basically you give up your citizenship if you acquire citizenship by illegal means, and if you get convicted of treason or terrorism. The next two, against the public good and serving with an enemy force, are some of the things that end up becoming circumstantial based upon specific enemies that are considered part of the state. And so we'll get into a little bit of this as part of the Japanese situation. So if we could advance the slide. We talk a little bit about the security threat and the uses of public good for prosecution in the absence. Part of revocation is the fact that you don't have a hearing and there is no appeal. So when a country decides that you are going to leave it, as was the case with the Japanese, you don't have any form of appeal. I mean, you could probably try to appeal it with the ILO, but if everybody is in war against a country like Japan was, you have no place to go. So these are things to think about as we go through and talk a little bit about the Japanese situation. If we could advance the slide. I'm going to go through a little bit of the legislation. Interestingly enough, I see that these are backwards. My apologies. If you advance it to the next slide, apparently I got these backwards. My apologies for this. We were subjects of Britain, and we were subjects of Britain until the Constitution Act in 1867. And if there was certain cases around evicting people from Britain, these were all done by individual acts of parliament. So if Britain was at war with a specific country, then they would institute legislation that indicated that they were at war and that naturalized citizens of Britain could be expelled due to being at war with particular individuals. In 1868, which is an interesting moment, there is a thing called Aliens and Naturalization Act, and we'll see this across the world is this term alien. And naturalization is a process of becoming a citizen, but if you're not a citizen, you're considered an alien. So you might want to think about that for a few minutes, because it's weird to be calling people aliens, but I guess that's an international term. It's in the ILO, it's in most of the legislation across the world as identifying individuals that are not part of the country. We did have an Immigration Act in 1910 to restrict specific elements, and I will say elements. It was mainly the Asiatic community of restricting them on what they could do. We also had in 1914, and you'll see a whole bunch of different acts right in a row here. We've got the British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act, Canadian Nationals Act, and this was to restrict movement of specific groups throughout Canada. And then, interestingly enough, we didn't have a Citizenship Act until 1946, and you see the date there, June 27th, 1946. We have an act respecting citizenship, nationality, naturalization, the status of aliens. And this basically outlines specifically what it was to be a citizen of Canada and what you had to do in order to be a citizen. And this was also supplemented by the British Nationality Act, which abolished us as British citizens in 1948. So if you'll go to the previous slide, my apologies for this being backwards, then you see the actual Citizenship Act of 1977, which outlined the whole process that we currently use today of the naturalization ceremonies and going through testing and a waiting period in order to become a Canadian citizen. And the rest of these are basically points in time where we have the British Nationality Act, the Japanese Agreement to restore citizenship because the Japanese were not considered citizens for a period of time. And then we instituted the Canadian citizenship test in 1995. So that gives you a real quick legislative, and it's over a period of time we've had many different rules that have been changed by orders and councils. So if you go to 2 slides forward, I'll talk a little bit about the orders in council in order to restrict the Japanese. And I'm using the Japanese as an example because there's a lot of material with respect to legislation, with respect to orders in council. And I just want to preface this by saying that the Japanese situation, there was a lot of disagreement as to whether the Japanese should be considered enemies or not. And interestingly enough, the RCMP, which notoriously over a history of period of time, the RCMP have not been necessarily always that open and welcoming to specific diverse groups. But when they were approached with respect to how they felt about the Japanese situation and whether they felt that Japanese were going to cause any issues in BC, the RCMP said, no, we don't see them as being a threat. And this is the National Police Force, so keep that in mind. But there was, and I think many of you may already know this history, there was a group called the Asiatic League who felt that the Japanese should be expelled and they didn't want the Asian interference regardless of whether it was Chinese or Japanese. And so they managed to convince the BC government, as you can see in 1941, with an order in council to require all Japanese to start registering. And then in 1942, every person of the Japanese race needed to leave the protected area, which was 100 miles along the seacoast. And if you'll go forward to the next slide, this just progressively gets more restrictive for the Japanese because in 46, in the 1486 Order in Council, it removes people forcibly, and it gives the authority to the RCMP to be able to go into homes and remove people and their possessions. as you can see with the Order in Council of 1665. If you will go to the next slide. It also allowed, in 1942, gave direction for, there was a group of individuals in BC who wanted to use the possessions of the Japanese, and they wanted the property to give to veterans. And so there was, as you can see by Order in Council 5523, it gave direction for the soldier settlement to be able to take this property and sell it. And they were able to dispose of the property. And all of this is really interesting from the standpoint of all the legislative pieces that go around this. So if you'll advance the slide to the next one, you'll see how this, in one fell swoop, becomes the War Measures Act that gives the state full control over the Japanese. And then progressively, the Japanese are required to register. Japan declares war and immediately are considered alien enemies and aliens of the state. And then in 42, the men are asked to relocate to camps. And then the War Measures Act relocates the 21,000 Japanese in 1942. In 43, all of the property is taken, and then the camps are established. And then we see in 1945 that the Japanese were given a choice, and it really wasn't much of a choice. And interestingly enough, it was a survey that went out to the Japanese that basically said, you can either move to a camp, which is going to be really difficult, and we won't give you much money, and you may have to work for that money. Or you can go to Japan, we'll give you a little bit of settlement money, and then you'll have to renounce your citizenship. And so, but it was one of those things that moving and relocating to Japan might be a while. So individuals knew that there was issues with the Japanese across the country being discriminated against, having a hard time. A lot of the camps and a lot of the relocation areas, people were toiling and the conditions were terrible. I have one interesting quote from one of the individuals who said, I'm just trying to see if I can find it. They were talking about the conditions of being basically in a pig pen, and felt that the conditions couldn't be any worse. And the government of BC felt that this was a good way to get Japanese to leave so that they didn't have to deal with them here in Canada. And so if we'll go to the next slide, what I've done is just give you a real quick recap of the revocation of citizenship. And it's hard to be able to talk in 30 minutes about citizenship and war, but I've tried to give you a very quick overview of the issues and the kinds of things that have been problematic for Japanese in general, and how this all became part and parcel because there was a movement of the Asiatic League, because the media was on supporting the Asiatic League and saying things like, we also had a member of the Vancouver Parliament who says, I don't believe that the Japanese are an assimilable race. Economically, we can't combat with them. Racially, we can't assimilate them. We must exclude them from our midst and prohibit them from owning land. It's the government's plan to get these people out of BC as fast as possible. It's my personal intention, as long as I remain in public life, to see they never come back here. Let our slogan be for BC, no Japs for the Rockies. And so, as you can see, there was some significant need to get rid of the Japanese because of basically prejudice and fear-mongering. And it's kind of sad, but not everyone agreed, but there was enough movement of the Asiatic League in BC in order to have all of this actually happen. And so I hope that this is giving you a little bit of an overview of what happens with war and citizenship. There's a lot of other things that I could say, but maybe there is a few questions before we begin our next panel that I can actually answer. I'm just going to say that international law has been very loose about citizenship and immigration. And as you can see, this quote from Audrey Macklem, that there's maximum discretionary power with minimum accountability in our laws around citizenship. So I hope that this is giving you a great quickie overview of citizenship and what can happen if it's revoked. So are there any questions? I unfortunately can't see the comments or anything. Jessica or
Hi. There's nothing popping up in the comments. I'll just give it a sec. I think it's fascinating listening to this, Hitomi, because I think what maybe Canadians don't really realize, and maybe white identifying perhaps or settler community is just how we excluded certain groups of people up to a certain point. And it was a lot of the, around, it was like 1948 and that when we finally started allowing Jewish people to have citizenship too. And, in the early 1900s, not only did we see all this stuff, but we saw like a pushing out of the Japanese and Chinese out of the fishing industries in BC. Like there was real intentional erasure of communities and a pushing out. And, and I think it was like about 1918 where they passed the Continuous Passages Act, for example, where they were trying to intentionally cut people off who had to go through another country because they knew it was mostly the brown folks, for example, that, couldn't get a direct pass right into Canada. So we have all that history at the beginning of the 1900s that I don't think we really know about and don't really recognize. And I think maybe my question to you is, I mean, today we've been talking about like undocumented workers and migrants and refugees. And do you see, like, how do you see this notions of citizenship playing out right now? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I find it really interesting because a lot of the terminology, a lot of the media, a lot of the things that have worked through with the Japanese, a lot of that vernacular and a lot of the arguments are the same arguments that are being used to exclude other groups. And we've seen it with the Indigenous population, and then we've seen it with the Black population when they were trying to exclude individuals in Arcadia as well, when the French were expelled from Nova Scotia. We've seen it when we've tried to exclude different groups just in general. And I find that this is a repetitive pattern that we use the same methods regardless of what group it is. And apparently for some reason there's always individuals who are sympathetic to this particular movement who get behind, this is only Canadian, this is, okay, I don't want to say this pejoratively, but it's only the white folk we want here. And we're not going to talk about anybody else. And we want to make sure it's this whole Aryan nation type of thing. And I don't want to be negative towards Aryan nation, but basically, the white people, you can't have anybody that looks a little different because they're not part of our group. They're not the in group. And so we're going to exclude the people who are not part of our group.
Well, and we got to create a narrative, even within the education system, of the white settler community has settled this country, done all this work. We sneak in little things like the head tax, but we've created this narrative that excludes, like, we don't realize that Muslim folk were coming in here in the 1800s, that Canada was built multiculturally from for hundreds of years, and through our education, we've really created a specific narrative, and it just kind of keeps reinforcing itself.
Well, and it's interesting to see, because I did a lot of study around immigration law over a period of time, and we've always been very exclusionary, and we've changed our laws in order to ensure that we could exclude specific groups. And we've tried to keep the law open enough where we could have that opening where we can exclude this particular group, but this group has been accepted now. So it's been an ongoing thing that we keep it open enough to allow refugees, because we've got to, we're a receiving country, but we want to be exclusive enough where we can exclude certain groups.
Yeah, it's quite phenomenal. So something for y'all to think about as we kind of transition into things. Thank you so much, Hitomi, for your time and your dedication to the convention, and for sharing this with us and getting our heads thinking about this notion of citizenship and what it means in Canada. So thank you so much for your time.